Until now, Donald Trump has been threatening the EU that harsh tariffs will be imposed. And if they tried retaliating, reciprocal tariffs would be imposed to teach them a lesson. However, no tangible tariffs were announced. But now, Donald Trump specifically threatened to put 200% tariffs on European wine and spirits. And which country it impacts the most? Well, France. That's because, in 2024 alone, France exported wine worth $2.5 billion to the United States. But the 200% tariffs can ruin everything. As a result, France is now in no mood to surrender or to appease Donald Trump, so he does not put the tariffs. Instead, Emmanuel Macron has decided to be offensive rather than defensive, making a bold move which Donald Trump did not expect. It even left the EU shocked, which is still thinking of a more suitable and less offensive strike back. But what did France really do? In this video, let's find out. At first glance, it seemed like Donald Trump was in control. His 200% tariff threat on French wine and spirits sent shockwaves across Europe, shaking an industry that had long relied on the US as its most valuable market. The American president had done this before, bullying trade partners, forcing them into negotiations, and strong-arming them into one-sided deals. Many assumed that France, like others, would bow to pressure, plead for exemptions, or try to de-escalate the situation. It has happened before, as Trump had revealed. But this time, Emmanuel Macron did something different. Instead of playing defense, he went on the offensive. Instead of trying to negotiate a way out, he decided to retaliate with full force before Trump could even finalize his tariffs. But why did Trump rush to hit the EU, with France being the main target? Well, while the move was framed as a means to protect American industries, many analysts saw it as a calculated strike against Emmanuel Macron, particularly following a public embarrassment Trump suffered over a diplomatic disagreement. Just weeks before the tariff threat, Macron had directly challenged Trump's claims about European financial contributions to Ukraine. In a widely publicized moment, Macron corrected Trump's assertion that the United States was carrying the financial burden alone, presenting figures that demonstrated that France and other EU nations had contributed significantly, in some cases even more than the US. Also, Trump said the EU offered loans and got its money back, to which Macron responded that they were never loans. However, if Ukraine wishes to give the money back, it will be welcomed. This public correction made headlines and was seen as a direct challenge to Trump's authority. For a leader who thrives on dominance, being contradicted so openly on the world stage was not something to be taken lightly. It was in the aftermath of this exchange that the tariff threats emerged, disproportionately affecting France, a coincidence too calculated to ignore. Among all European nations, France was the biggest target of these tariffs, and the economic damage was undeniable. The United States was France's largest foreign market for wine and spirits, with over $2.5 billion in exports in 2024 alone. A sudden tariff hike of 200% would immediately make French wine and spirits unaffordable for American consumers, effectively wiping out a key sector of France's trade balance. Unlike mass-produced consumer goods, luxury products such as champagne, Bordeaux, and cognac thrive on stable pricing and exclusivity. If their prices were suddenly doubled, American importers and distributors would be forced to cancel orders, leaving French producers with no alternative markets that could absorb the same volume at comparable profit margins. For small and medium-sized vineyards, the stakes were even higher. Large wine corporations might have been able to withstand the blow by shifting exports to Asia or diversifying their product lines. But family-owned businesses and smaller vineyards relied almost entirely on the U.S. market. Many producers had spent decades building strong relationships with American distributors and consumers, relationships that could be cut off overnight if the tariffs were imposed. The reaction within the French wine industry was immediate and filled with outrage. Trade associations, vineyard owners, and export groups warned that these tariffs would be disastrous, not just for wine producers but for the entire ecosystem that supports France's world-renowned wine industry. Analysts pointed out that this wasn't just a commercial setback. It was an attack on one of France's most valuable and culturally significant industries. Economic experts emphasized the gravity of the situation, explaining that a 200% tax on wine and spirits would bring exports to the U.S. to a complete halt. With nearly €4 billion in annual sales at risk, the loss would be felt across supply chains, from vineyards to bottle manufacturers to global logistics companies that facilitate international trade. Some industry leaders described the announcement as shocking and catastrophic, noting that the U.S. had long been the most important market for French wine exports. The impact on pricing was another major concern. If a bottle of champagne that normally sold for $60 in the U.S. suddenly cost $120, industry analysts explained that very few consumers would continue buying at those prices. While the ultra-wealthy might still be willing to purchase high-end French wines, the mass market, the real driver of the industry, would completely collapse. For smaller champagne houses, where 10 to 15% of annual sales depended on the American market, these tariffs were seen as a death sentence. Distributors were already preparing to cancel orders, knowing they could not sustain sales under such inflated costs. Importers in the U.S. were equally concerned, as they faced the choice of passing on higher costs to consumers or abandoning French wine altogether in favor of cheaper alternatives from Italy, Spain, or even domestically produced American wines. While wine and spirits were at the center of the crisis, analysts stressed that the fallout from Trump's tariffs would go far beyond the vineyards. France's wine industry is deeply connected to tourism, branding, and export revenue, and a sudden collapse in exports would disrupt entire regional economies. Wine-producing regions in France rely heavily on international trade to sustain their businesses, and the ripple effects of a major market loss would spread to sectors including logistics, advertising, hospitality, and agriculture. Beyond economic concerns, Trump's move was seen by many as a direct test of Macron's leadership. The French president had positioned himself as one of Europe's strongest voices against Trump's policies, particularly on trade and diplomacy. By threatening France's most valuable export industry, Trump was sending a clear message. Those who challenge his authority will face economic retaliation. Observers noted that this wasn't the first time Trump had used trade as a political weapon. During his first term, he imposed tariffs on China, Canada, and the EU, often using them as leverage in broader geopolitical disputes. However, in this case, the focus on France seemed unusually personal. Given the timing, so soon after Macron's public correction of Trump over Ukraine aid contributions, many experts argued that this was less about trade policy and more about personal revenge, and Macron is ready for that. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, and current affairs impacting your lives. Donald Trump had likely expected Europe to hesitate, negotiate, or delay retaliation after his threat to impose a 200% tariff on European wine and spirits. But instead of following the usual slow-moving diplomatic approach, Emmanuel Macron flipped the tables. Before the European Union could even finalize its own response, Macron took matters into his own hands, sending an unambiguous message to Washington. France would retaliate immediately and with equal force. Macron announced that if Trump imposed his tariffs on French wine and spirits, France would instantly slap reciprocal tariffs on U.S. steel and aluminum exports. This wasn't just a warning. It was a strategic and immediate counterattack. The move was designed to mirror the economic pain that Trump was threatening to inflict on France, making sure that the consequences would be just as severe for American industries. This wasn't a defensive posture or an attempt to de-escalate. It was an offensive strike, signaling that if Trump wanted a trade war, France would not be the one backing down. The speed of Macron's response shattered expectations. Historically, European nations had been slow to respond to U.S. trade aggression, preferring to exhaust all diplomatic avenues before resorting to economic retaliation. Trump had banked on this sluggishness, assuming that Europe would either cave under pressure or spend months debating a response. But Macron's decision to act unilaterally and aggressively caught not just the U.S. off guard, but also many within the EU itself. But why did Macron decide to threaten to impose tariffs on U.S. steel and aluminum? Well, Macron's choice of steel and aluminum as his counterstrike was anything but random. It was deliberate and strategic. Trump had spent years protecting these industries, imposing his own tariffs on European and Chinese metal imports to support U.S. manufacturers, automakers, and the defense sector. Macron saw an opportunity to hit back where it would hurt the most. By targeting steel and aluminum, France was striking at the very core of Trump's economic policy. Trump had positioned himself as the champion of American industry, repeatedly promising to revive the domestic steel and aluminum sectors through protectionist measures. But Macron's move put those promises in jeopardy. If U.S. metal exports suddenly became less competitive in Europe, American manufacturers would face a serious dilemma. They would either have to lower their prices to stay in the European market or risk losing business to European and Asian competitors. This was a brilliant tactical maneuver for several reasons. First, it put Trump in a political bind. If Trump continued escalating tariffs, he would now be directly harming U.S. steel and aluminum industries, which had been among his core supporters. Second, it sent a message to American businesses. By showing that France could retaliate swiftly, it forced U.S. industry leaders to question whether Trump's trade war was really in their best interests. Furthermore, it raised the economic stakes for the U.S. If American steel and aluminum companies started losing European contracts, the cost of Trump's trade war would be felt at home, not just abroad. Interestingly, Macron's counterstrike wasn't an isolated decision. It was backed by a strong, unified stance from the French government. Almost immediately after Macron's announcement, key ministers reinforced France's position, making it clear that this was not a bluff. The French Foreign Trade Minister, Laurent Saint-Martin, directly accused Trump of escalating the trade war unnecessarily, making it clear that France would not fold under pressure. His firm stance indicated that France saw this as a fight it was willing to take all the way if necessary. Meanwhile, French Finance Minister Éric Lombard took a more direct and blunt approach. He dismissed the trade war as stupid, but pointed out that if the U.S. wanted to negotiate from a position of strength, then France needed to respond with equal force. French Prime Minister François Bayrou took it a step further, framing the issue as a matter of European sovereignty. He emphasized that France, and Europe as a whole, could not afford to yield to American economic threats. His words weren't just about tariffs. They were about Europe's place in the global economy and its ability to stand up to U.S. pressure. The underlying message was clear. If the U.S. thought it could bully Europe, it was mistaken. This level of unified defiance within the French government sent a strong signal to Washington. France was not alone in this fight, and if Trump escalated, the entire French political establishment was ready to push back. This has not only shocked Trump but also the EU. While Macron was taking swift action, the rest of the European Union was still deliberating. Germany, Spain, and Italy were hesitant to embrace full retaliation, preferring a more careful approach centered around negotiations. The EU Trade Commission, caught off guard by Macron's aggressive move, was still weighing its options and had not yet reached a unified position. But Macron's decisiveness left the EU with no choice. If France was already taking such a strong stand, the EU risked looking weak and divided if it failed to act. The pressure to follow France's lead grew rapidly, and within days, EU leaders began hardening their positions. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who had initially favored a diplomatic resolution, conceded that the EU was strong enough to retaliate if necessary. However, he still hoped for cooperation over conflict. This measured response showed that Germany was hesitant to fully embrace a trade war, but was now preparing for the possibility. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen took a firmer stance, warning that tariffs would hurt businesses and consumers on both sides. Her remarks suggested that while Europe did not want a trade war, it was prepared to act if provoked. Macron's bold move forced the EU to take a tougher stance. While some leaders still hoped for negotiation, France's immediate counterstrike showed that Europe could not afford to be seen as passive. Now the question was whether Trump would escalate or back down. Would he risk an all-out transatlantic trade war, or would the pressure from U.S. industries, global markets, and diplomatic allies force him to reconsider? However, one thing was certain. France had changed the game, and the next move was now in Trump's hands. What do you think? Will France's response to Trump's tariffs work? Or do you believe Trump might like to show who is in charge, and he might put even harsher tariffs on France? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on the best strategy France should follow to deal with Trump's tariffs. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, changing world order, and current affairs, things you need to stay informed. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.